It's Monday, January 6th, 2025, and let's do a rewind of last week's history that we need to know for the struggle ahead. Let's go. Let's start with an historical event from 1862 that could be the origins of modern watch night services that are observed in a lot of churches in this country, but particularly black churches. So, this history tidbit, December 31st, 1862, watch meetings for Emancipation Proclamation. The history says that African Americans across the United States, free and enslaved, in the North and South, held watch meetings for the Emancipation Proclamation that officially abolished slavery in the Confederate States. Not all of them, issued by Abraham Lincoln on September 22nd. The proclamation did not take effect until January 1, 1863. Bill Bigelow explains in Rethinking Lincoln on the 150th birthday of the Emancipation Proclamation, he writes this quote, "Interestingly, despite the fact that the proclamation is mentioned in virtually every textbook, it is never printed in its entirety. Perhaps that's because, despite its lofty sounding title, this is no stirring document of liberty or equality. In fact, it does not even criticize slavery. Emancipation is presented purely as a measure of military necessity. Lincoln offered freedom to enslaved people in those areas only, quote, in rebellion against the United States," end quote. That's literally the language in the Emancipation Proclamation. So it did not apply to all of the states. It reads like a document written by a lawyer, one who happened to be a commander-in-chief, not an abolitionist. It even goes county by county, listing areas where slavery would remain in force. And again, this is language directly from the proclamation, quote, precisely as if this proclamation were not issued, end quote. In the language of the Emancipation Proclamation, these words are in that document explaining that in these counties, slavery will remain in force because these counties are not in states that were rebellious to the Union, so we don't have a problem with you and your slaves. But in these counties, slavery will be abolished because these counties were in states that were in rebellion against the United States, so they can't have their slavery anymore. And when in the Emancipation Proclamation, when it talks about the counties where they could maintain slavery, the language said precisely as if this proclamation were not issued. Now, according to Eric Foner, the proclamation left more than 20% of enslaved people still in slavery. That's 800,000 out of 3.9 million people. Now, no doubt, the Emancipation Proclamation was a huge deal. It was cheered by abolitionists and even those who remained enslaved. As the great African American abolitionist Frederick Douglass pointed out, Lincoln's proclamation united, quote, the cause of the slaves and the cause of the country, end quote. Those opposed to slavery were determined to use the Emancipation Proclamation as an instrument to end slavery everywhere and forever, regardless of Lincoln's more limited intent. Freedom would be won and not given. And that freedom was won by the enslaved people who defeated the system of slavery, of chattel slavery, of plantation slavery in this country and won their own freedom Again, the Emancipation Proclamation took effect on January 1, 1863. Bill Bigelow says, again, this is another quote from him. He says, with rare exceptions like the American Social History Project, Center for Media and Learning, City University of New York's fine Freedom's Unfinished Revolution, middle and high school textbooks fail to credit the real anti-slavery heroes in the story of emancipation, the enslaved themselves, along with their black and white abolitionist allies. So that's really important information for us to know about the Emancipation Proclamation. And please go find it and read the actual complete document that you have probably never seen up to this point in your history. All right, so let's go on to the next item of historical importance, and this is incredibly important. January 1, 1804, Haitian independence. Speaking for the Negro, I can say we owe much to Walker for his appeal, to John Brown for the blow struck at Harper's Ferry, and to the anti-slavery societies at home and abroad, but we owe incomparably more to Haiti than to them all. I regard her as the original pioneer emancipator of the 19th century. That was Frederick Douglass, speaking of Haiti and her independence. Haiti became a free republic after a revolution that began in 1791, declaring independence for all people from colonial rule and enslavement on January 1, 1804. Frederick Douglass, who served as U.S. Minister to Haiti from 1889 to 1891 until he resigned in protest, gave a lecture on the history of Haiti and the U.S. treatment of Haiti that is as relevant and informative today as it was when he gave it on January 2, 1893. He begins, quote, "My subject is Haiti, the Black Republic, the only self-made Black Republic in the world. I'm here to speak to you of her character, her history, her importance, and her struggle from slavery to freedom and to statehood. I am to speak to you of her progress in the line of civilization, of her relation with the United States, of her past and present, of her probable destiny, and of the bearing of her example as a free and independent republic upon what may be the destiny of the African race in our own country and elsewhere." And he continues on the unique role of Haiti by saying, quote, "Until she, Haiti, spoke, no Christian nation had abolished Negro slavery. Until she spoke, no Christian nation had given to the world an organized effort to abolish slavery. Until Haiti spoke, the slave ship followed by hungry sharks, greedy to devour the dead and dying slaves flung overboard to feed them, plowed in peace the South Atlantic, painting the sea with the Negro's blood. Until she spoke, the slave trade was sanctioned by all the Christian nations of the world, and our land of liberty and light included. Men made fortunes by this infernal traffic and were esteemed as good Christians and the standing types and representations of the Savior of the world. Until Haiti spoke, the church was silent and the pulpit was dumb. Slave traders lived and slave traders died. Funeral sermons were preached over them, and of them it was said that they died in the triumphs of the Christian faith and went to heaven among the just." That is, until Haiti spoke. Let's go on, shall we, to another incredibly important historical moment. At the beginning of the year, January 1, 1923, the Rosewood Massacre. It has been a struggle telling this story over the years because a lot of people don't want to hear about this kind of history, but Mama told me to keep it alive, so I keep telling it. It's a sad story, but it's one I think everyone needs to hear. Lizzie Jenkins, niece of a Rosewood school teacher. The Rosewood Massacre or pogrom, which led to the total destruction of the rural black town in Florida, began on January 1, 1923. A white posse formed, spurred by the false accusation of a white married woman who claimed to have been beaten by an unnamed black man, but most likely she was lying to cover for the beating that she got from her white lover that she didn't want to get another beating from her white husband for being involved in. The posse carried out lynchings of African Americans and burned the town to the ground. Let's go on to another important moment in the history of struggle. January 2, 1944. A 15-year-old boy was lynched in Florida for sending a love note. On January 2, 1944, 15-year-old Willie James Howard, a black boy, was kidnapped and lynched by 3 white men in Suwannee County, Florida, after being accused of sending a love note to the daughter of one of the men. During Christmas 1943, Willie Howard sent cards to all of his co-workers at the Van Priest dime store in Live Oak, Florida. Unlike the other cards, Willie's card to Cynthia Goff, a white store employee, revealed a youthful crush. His greeting expressed hope that white people would someday like black people and concluded, "I love your name, I love your voice. For SH, sweetheart, you are my choice." After reading the card, Cynthia's father, Phil Goff, brought 2 friends to the Howard home and demanded to see Willie. Despite his mother's pleading, the men dragged Willie away and then kidnapped Willie's father, James Howard, from work. The men drove the 2 Howards to the embankment of the Suwannee River, bound Willie's hands and feet, stood him at the edge of the water, and told him to either jump or be shot. Willie jumped into the cold water below and drowned, while his father was forced to watch at gunpoint. Willie's dead body was pulled from the river the next day. Goff and his accomplices later admitted to the local sheriff that they took Willie to the river to punish him, but claimed the team had become hysterical and jumped into the water unprovoked at the thought of being whipped by his father. Fearful for his own life and the other members of his family, James Howard signed a statement supporting Goff's account. He and his family fled Live Oak 3 days later and then shared the story of Willie's lynching. January 3rd. 19 Hopi leaders imprisoned in Alcatraz. On this day, January 3rd, in 1895, federal authorities imprisoned 19 Hopi leaders at Alcatraz Island on sedition charges. Why? For opposing the U.S. government's forced education and assimilation of their children. In the late 1800s, the U.S. government sought to Americanize Native American children by forcing them into white-run assimilationist schools, often far from their homes and families. In 1887, the government established Keams Canyon Boarding School in modern-day Arizona and pressured Native American parents from the Hopi tribe to enroll their children. Hopi families that complied with the government's order and sent their children to school were deemed friendlies, while those who refused were branded hostiles. When most parents refused to part with their children voluntarily, because most parents would, the government resorted to force, sending soldiers to round up the children and send them to Keams Canyon. At the time, tensions were rising regarding the limited land that the government claimed to still belong to Hopi communities. In October 1894, 50 Hopi returned to plant on land that had traditionally belonged to their tribe, doing something they had always done in the years before, but the U.S. government, claiming to act in defense of the right of the friendlies, responded by ordering troops to arrest the Hopi leaders, justifying the order for military involvement. One government official wrote that, quote, the friendlies must be protected in their rights and encouraged to continue in the Washington way, end quote. We have to protect the Hopi people who are willing to sign over their children and their identities and become who we want them to be from the Hopi people who refused our efforts to force them to become white. Or at least American. After the January 1895 arrests, the San Francisco Chronicle reported that, quote, 19 murderous-looking Apache Indians had been imprisoned at Alcatraz because they would not let their children go to school. The lie. The paper added that they have not hardship aside from the fact that they have been rudely snatched from the bosom of their families and are prisoners, and prisoners they shall stay until they have learned to appreciate the advantage of education. Please understand, folks, that white people in this country have always been comfortable with lying about non-white people's relationship with education and their children, claiming that we don't value education for our children, when really we have been opposing colonial education of our children and forced assimilation of our children to the settler colonial genocidal society that ripped us away from our culture. You are getting a glimpse into where the modern day lies that come from people like Joe Biden and the Betsy DeVosses and the Arnie Duncans and the Bill Clintons and the Barack Obamas about non-white and mostly working class and poor parents not being committed to education for their children. So this is why education has to be privatized now, because the politicians can't trust you poor people to care enough about your kids' education, to send them to school like you should, when really we are fighting for a decolonial education for our children and a respect of our children's indigenous cultures. That was on this day, in January 3rd, 1895. How about January 3rd, 1966, 66, I was born in 67, Sammy Young Jr. was murdered. Sammy Young Jr. was killed at a gas station in Macon County, Alabama, for using the whites-only bathroom. Young was a 21-year-old African-American Tuskegee Institute student and a voting rights activist who had lost a kidney while serving in the U.S. Navy, defending this country. On January 6, 1966, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee issued a statement condemning Young's murder and against the war in Vietnam. SNCC saw Young's murder as a clear example of the U.S. government's supposed fight for freedom abroad. At the same time, it denied that freedom to its black citizens at home. SNCC said, quote, the murder of Samuel Young in Tuskegee, Alabama is no different than the murder of peasants in Vietnam, for both Young and the Vietnamese sought and are seeking to secure the rights guaranteed them by law. In each case, the United States government bears a great part of the responsibility for these deaths. Samuel Young was murdered because United States law is not being enforced. Vietnamese are murdered because the United States is pursuing an aggressive policy in violation of international law. The United States is no respecter of persons or law when such persons or laws run counter to its needs or desires. And isn't that still true of this country and its policies? SNCC's statement called out the hypocrisy of the U.S. government, which claimed to wage a war for democracy overseas at the same moment it was also waging war against those fighting for democracy in the United States. We maintain, SNCC said, that our country's cry of preserve freedom in the world is a hypocritical mask behind which it squashes liberation movements which are not bound and refuse to be bound by the expediencies of United States Cold War policies. And SNCC asks in this statement, where is the draft for the freedom fight in the United States? Here's something that we should know about right now, because this could be very useful for our ongoing struggle in our public schools. January 4, 1977, students successfully sue school board over book bans. Fed up with books being banned by the school administration, on January 4, 1977, students at Island Trees High School in Long Island, New York, along with the New York Civil Liberties Union, sued the school board for this unconstitutional censorship. Led by Island Trees Student Council President Stephen Pico, the case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. Board of Education, Island Trees Union Free School District Number 26 versus Pico in 1982. In 1975, members of the Island Trees School Board attended a conference sponsored by a conservative education group. Following the conference, the board attempted to ban several books from schools in their district. The books that the board found to be anti-American, anti-Christian, anti-Semitic, and just plain filthy were the following: Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut Jr., The Naked Ape by Desmond Morris, Down These Mean Streets by Perry Thomas, Best Short Stories of Negro Writers, edited by Langston Hughes, Go Ask Alice, Anonymous, Laughing Boy by Oliver Lafarge, Black Boy by Richard Wright, A Hero Ain't Nothing But a Sandwich by Alice Childress, Soul on Ice by Eldridge Cleaver, A Reader for Writers, edited by Jerome Archer, The Fixer by Bernard Malamud. As Anthony Aycock wrote for the Washington Post, after an initial burst of media attention, the plaintiffs returned to being students, leaving the legal work to the lawyers. In 1979, the district court ruled in favor of the school board. It responded that while, quote, removal of such books from a school library may indeed, in this court's view, does reflect a misguided educational philosophy, it does not constitute a sharp and direct infringement of any First Amendment right, end quote. An appellate court reversed that decision in 1980 and remanded the case back to the district court, prompting the Supreme Court to step in. In June 1982, the court ruled 5-4 in the students' favor. In his opinion, Justice William J. Brennan Jr. wrote that while, quote, local school boards have a substantial, legitimate role to play in the determination of school library content, those boards' authority must be exercised in a manner that comports with the transcendent imperatives of the First Amendment. In other words, school officials can't ditch books just because they don't like them. It would be great if we would stop wringing our hands over what the conservatives are planning to do in Project 2025 and close down public schools and ban more books and take them to fucking court. How about the Lemon Grove incident? January 5, 1931, Mexican-American students were barred from attending their local elementary school. What the parents do? Took the school district to court. Some of the earliest court cases concerning school desegregation occurred in the Southwest in California in the 1830s. In these cases, Mexican immigrants and their communities were the targeted groups of segregation by school officials. A case of particular importance occurred in the San Diego County during the 1930s in the then rural community of Lemon Grove. On January 5th, 1931, Jerome T. Green, principal of the Lemon Grove Grammar School, acting under instructions from the school trustees, stood at the door and admitted all pupils except the Mexican students. Principal Green announced that the Mexican children did not belong at the school, could not enter, and instructed them to attend two-room building constructed to house Mexican children. Dejected, embarrassed, and angry, the Mexican children left the school and returned home. Instructed by their parents, they refused to attend the so-called new school that had been built for them. In the words of students of the time, it wasn't a school, it was an old building. Everyone called it La Caballeriza, the barnyard. This was a turn of events that the school board had not counted on. Do you notice that in the history of white supremacy, that the settler colonists, the white supremacists, same people, settler colonialism is white supremacy, and white supremacists are settler colonists. But the settler colonialists, they want to keep non-European descended people out from among them. But then they get angry when we don't like that we're being discriminated against. Like, they honestly expect to tell us, you don't belong here. We don't want you here. This is ours. We know we took it from you, but it's ours now, and you can't have it. You don't belong here. And we're just supposed to what? Recognize their superiority and go, yes, great white father, thank you for throwing the crumb. And then they get mad when we're like, oh, for real? Fuck you. We're not taking this shit. We were here before you. And they're shocked. They're shocked when we're upset that our human rights and dignity are violated by them, the thieves, murderers, and liars. Amazing the hubris these people have. Anyway, let us continue. This was a turn of events that the school board had not counted on. The board expected the Mexican children and families to act docile, follow orders, and attend the new school. Ugh. The Mexican parents rallied together and, through the Mexican consulate, acquired legal counsel and support. The school incident became a test case of the power of the district attorney and the school board to create a separate school for Mexican children. This case, Roberto Alvarez versus the Board of Trustees of the Lemon Grove School District, was the first successful school desegregation court decision in the history of the United States. It is important in San Diego and U.S. history, not solely because it occurred, but because the community took court action and won the case. They established the rights of their children to equal education, despite local, regional, and national sentiment that favored not only segregation, but the actual deportation of the Mexican population in the United States. This case is a testimony of the San Diego Mexican community's rights and their actions toward equality and education, not just for their own children, but for the Mexican population in California and for the United States. Again, this is the Lemon Grove case from 1931 in San Diego, California. Join me next Monday for another History Rewind in Luqman Nation. Peace.